This is the Forbes Books Podcast, conversations with amazing humans who are impacting the world of business and beyond. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and Kate Morgan is in the studio with me today. Kate is the innovative founder and CEO of Boston Human Capital Partners, a recruiting management and consulting firm that revolutionized the industry with its embedded partner approach, and we'll get into that in a bit. As a passionate problem solver, Kate thrives on tackling complex team-building challenges, leveraging her expertise to help companies achieve HR excellence. Kate, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
It's nice that you're here. And so I want to start by talking about the word talent. So I'm old enough to remember that talent was celebrities, actors, singers, artists. And then all of a sudden, maybe, I don't know, it was in the 90s, we're like, oh yeah, no, people who work in jobs have talent. And you've been doing this long enough, I don't want to date you, but you've been doing this long enough where you remember the days where the word talent wasn't really a thing. So how would you define that? Like, what is talent?
Well, first, I'm just going to say I'm really glad that we migrated from the word personnel or staffing, staff. So no, I love the idea of talent because talent's sort of like the difference between IQ and EQ. So with talent, you can always evolve just like you can evolve your emotional intelligence, where IQ feels like it's a little, static.
Yeah. And so tell me about this world where it's changing, because you've been doing this for quite a while, and I want to get this right because it's a mouthful. You revolutionized the recruiting industry when you brought the embedded partner approach in 2011. So as you can tell, I'm quite uneducated and don't know what any of those words mean. So what is it? What do you mean by the embedded partner approach?
So I believe that recruiting is just flat out broken. So when you look at contingency recruiting or retained search, it's coin operated. So all that you're working with, they're not partners. They're working for money, for the dollar. With an embedded partner, we're going to be an extension of your talent. So we go in and we're going to help build your team, grow it, recruit for it, but we're going to take a different approach that's really going to be about finding the right person, not just Mr. Right Now or Mrs. Right Now.
Right.
So that's really what it's about.
It almost rings of like fractional, like CMOs. Is it a version of that in the recruiting space?
Yeah, except for when I get a little twitchy when I hear fractional.
Oh, sorry. Uh-oh.
Ding, ding, ding. Well, when you think of fractional, it sort of says that I'm going to do it in a piece and I'm going to put it down. For us, we're really thinking about our clients. Even if they don't have a role that they're openly recruiting for, we're trying to think a few steps ahead of them. In a fractional component, it's going to be just locked down to that one project.
So, and this is something that's always been a pet peeve of mine, and I get twitchy about this, is the idea of project management and how everything, was it done well, was it done? And that's sort of the world we live in now. Like, we're all about checking boxes, using project management software. And so how do you cultivate that mindset when you run your embedded agency? And the reason I ask this is most people will be like, okay, cool, I'm going to be a recruiter. I get this person. Oh, okay, check the box. I got that done. All right, let me move on to the next thing. How do you take that mindset and infuse it into your team?
Well, I think it's based on that we try to be trusted advisors. That's when we know we've evolved into that next layer of a partnership with our clients. And so we'll have clients that we work with for years.
Wow.
And so, and we understand that we're focused on early stage companies for the most part. So it's ebbs and flows. They may need us for something and then they may pause us. But at least when they pick us back up, we can just jump right back in place. It's not even like have to rethink things because we already know how they operate and we're there to help facilitate their continued growth.
And what's the value proposition? I mean, you kind of broke it down, but what's the value proposition between hiring an embedded firm as opposed to just signing up for a recruiting firm to be like, hey, find me this position kind of thing? And I know it's more long-term goals with it, but like what in terms of getting that talent?
Yeah.
Well, what are the differences?
Yeah. So the problem with contingency recruiting, which is that headhunter, is, again, because it's coin operated, if they're going to get somebody that's any decent level, they're not just going to share it with you. They're going to share it with 5 other companies because at the end of the day, they want to make the most money from that hire. And they're not guaranteed if, even though they present that person will get placed. So they need to spread that out by bringing on other clients. So they're not really partnered because they're ultimately creating a competitive situation with a candidate. That's where, again, it's kind of broken.
Wow. Interesting. Yeah. And so tell me a little about this recruiter world, because, I've worked with a bunch of them, and it seems like it could be cutthroat because, you're all, because you hear all the stories about the talent pool getting so shallow. There's not enough talent. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think that's the sort of the common refrain these days. But what is it like trying to find the right talent these days in the world of whether you're an embedded agency or a consistency, like how hard is it?
I always think it's kind of funny because we do hear about it being really hard. So when you work with like a contingency recruiter, their average response rate is 5% when they reach out, when they're direct sourcing for candidates, 5%.
Wait, so 5% to the people they're reaching out for the job?
Yeah, only 5% will respond. We average 20 to 25%.
All right, you got to break that down, the difference. Why? Because that's a huge difference.
Yeah, well, it boils down to that recruiters tend to think of the job, and we don't think of the job because people take companies, not jobs. So we're already starting with a very different mindset. And so when we're reaching out to people, we then flip the script to be, it's why them, why now? And so having that initial email, we get to have a more direct conversation of why we wanted to introduce them to this company. And they appreciate that and focus on it being more like an exploratory conversation than actually being like selling them into a company.
And just to satisfy my curiosity, why the 5%? Why so low? Is it just people just don't trust recruiters, or what?
It's their approach.
Yeah.
They're flinging a job and they're like, hey, do you want to talk to us about this job?
Oh, yeah.
And they're doing it based on numbers. So I tell my team when they come on board,
it's spaghetti against the wall. They're basically throwing a shit.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And it's really frustrating.
So that's why the number's so low. It's just because it's almost like unintentional recruiting. Like they're just throwing it out to whoever is this database of people that have put their resume in it. They're just putting it out to everybody, regardless of what the position is, whether it fits or whatever. Okay.
Yeah. And I find it hysterical because when I'll have recruiters reach out to recruit me to be like a Java developer. It's like, what is this? And it's also indicative of what scares me about AI coming into recruiting, because again, we need that level of emotional intelligence. We need to be able to think through it. I won't even hire a recruiter into my firm. I spend too much time having to break bad habits. I'd rather take raw talent and develop them, give them a career path.
That's great. That's awesome. And I want to talk about the phrase transferable skills. Because I remember pre-pandemic, if you talk to anyone in the recruiting or HR space, they didn't believe it. Like it was not a thing. No. If you had this job, you must have this other job somewhere else. Then all of a sudden the pandemic happened, great resignation. We talk about the talent pool, and all of a sudden like, oh yeah, transferable skills. Those are actually pretty important. So give me your take on transferable skills.
Well, you can teach a lot of people things, right? So you take those transferable skills, you can evolve them. For me, even like when we look at hiring for our clients and for ourselves internally, we base it all on core values. So I know because of my core values, if a candidate for us has all 5, I can train them the rest. It's going to be an interesting situation moving forward because we've heard so many people that ended up dropping out of college, just simply didn't attend because of COVID. They're like, why should I do that? Right. And so all of that core values, that's going to be part of this. So take some of the skills that you've learned from various functions and evolve them, move them into a different role.
Why do you think it took the pandemic for people to sort of acknowledge the importance of that? Is it just because it was just like an awakening or a black swan event? We're like, oh shit, I guess that stuff, it really is important. That actually does work.
It's a good question. I think because of working in earlier stage companies, and we were also competing against big tech. Big tech paid big dollars. So I think for startups, they tended to be a little bit more open to looking for things that they could segue into their roles, because if they could allow for that and not check every box, they didn't have to look for the purple squirrel. They were like, okay, what could be applied?
Yeah, no, it's great. And, what's fascinating now is, as a card-carrying Gen Xer, I was brought up into, You go to school, you get that job, you work in that same place for 40 years, you retire, you drop dead, and then that's it. Now, people are more mobile. People are more thinking of, not instant gratification, but like they want to be satisfied and they don't want to wait around until their 401k gets to a certain number and then move on to another job. So what is it like in the recruitment space? Again, you've been doing this long enough that you've sort of seen the sea change in terms of like people's mindset when it comes to careers. How does that make it harder or easier when it comes to recruiting?
We did see different time span being spent within an organization. So where it used to be maybe 5 to 7 years as an average, it dropped down to a year, even less.
Wow.
And that's a problem. So it's really hard to do anything of significance in a role less than a year. But here's the interesting fact: is particularly in fast-growing companies, and it's also kind of aligns with another thread for me, is I don't believe in job descriptions because job descriptions are a snapshot in time. I need to know what it looks like 12 months out. What does success look like there? And we had the Great Resignation, but I think in a lot of situations, it was just they did their job and then they were bored because their managers didn't know what to do. Their VCs and private equity firms were saying, just hire, just get the body in, and then it'll figure it out. But they didn't know how to figure it out. And then we had managers who weren't strong leaders. And so people were just frustrated. And I think one of the things with younger generations is they do want to have a purpose, but they have to be told directly what their purpose is. And so it's not a one-tiered thing. There's a lot of things that kind of roll out.
Yeah. And, you brought up the fact that the job description, you're the second person who's told me this, like they hate it, but it's one of those things where you can't avoid it. So for folks listening to this, be like, all right, I got to fill a role, but I get what you're saying about the job description, but like, what do you put in there then?
You bracket it. Tell me what 0 to 3 months, maybe it's 0 to 6 months. Just show me what is expected during those time breakouts. And it's funny,
but that requires a lot of intention. I don't think a lot of people want to put in that work.
That's why it has to be done.
Yeah.
And it's funny because when I go into a client and we say, hey, I don't want your job description, they're like, oh, thank God. I'm like, no. We're going to actually make it harder for you because we really need to know what it looks like. And a lot of times, I'll be having a conversation with an executive CEO, and I'll just be able to kind of pick up the nuances, and I can build that job description, if you will, the way I use it out. But I think it's really important that they actually think in those terms.
Okay, and you mentioned the search bill. Let's talk to the actual hire, because you hear all about the stats of how a bad hire can cost a company X amount of dollars. You probably know these stats better than I do. But they also are making it more complicated. I think if you talk to most people, it's on average you're doing at least 5 or 6 interviews for a certain job, and it could be like a entry-level job, and they're putting you through the ringer. Is it right, wrong? Tell me about the actual process of hiring.
So this is where I get a little bit more like...
are you getting twitchy again?
No.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, I was going to say, I'm like, oh boy, I'm going 3 strikes and I'm out here.
No. It boils down to, in our role on some level, we almost have to be like the Nat Geo film, photographer.
Yeah.
The gazelle has to get eaten by the lion. And my team will get a little frustrated because they're like, oh, they keep going with these interviews and these interviews. I'm like, you have to remember that this is part of their culture, and it's a bit of a hazing.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily, if they ask, how do I feel that the process is going, I may say you could probably shrink it here or there, trim that off.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I think the candidate needs it as much as the employer.
Yeah. But do you sometimes think it could be paralysis by analysis? Like the fact that instead of maybe 2 or 3 people having a voice, it's 8 or 9.
Oh, yeah. And particularly now because everybody's still doing everything by video. So it becomes a little fragmented, and then they come together and you do get a little group think. I worked with a CTO a few years back, and he had the best thing. He would basically say to his employees or his team, 1 through 5, you can't pick 3. And it distilled it down to the salient point of, is this person worth it? And if they were kind of leaning towards 3, well, no, then it's a 2.
Yeah.
And we can move on from that. So I kind of like getting the various interviewers their feedback independently because of that groupthink. And if they're like kind of stumbling and they're like, oh, I don't know, just call them out on that.
Interesting. That's good. You mentioned video recruiting. We talked about the pandemic. Obviously the world of remote work is here to stay. How is that affecting recruiting? How much of a driver is it the fact that people be like, man, I'd love to work for this company, but I really don't want to live in Northern California. I don't want to live in Seattle. Fill in the blank.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because we're seeing all these companies that are now shifting and they're like, everybody back in the office.
Yeah.
And it's really just a way to kind of cull down the team. So we're still big advocates for hybrid models. Again, some cultures they feel like they need to have that. We're also seeing younger generations really want to be part of a group. They want to go into the office. Maybe not 5 days a week, but certainly, 2 or 3.
Yeah. It's funny. I think the hybrid is probably the best way to go nowadays because I think now, and this is my thing, if you walk into any office that's knowledge workers or white collar, everyone is so tied to their computer device. They're not looking up. They're not walking around the halls. So what's the point of having people sit in the office 40 hours a week to stare at a screen? They could stare at the screen in their house.
Yeah.
And obviously you get the old school like leaders be like, I want to have people run into each other at the water fountain so they could bounce around ideas. Well, if there's a water fountain behind me, there's nobody walking back there. You know what I'm saying? So I think that's one of the things where it's like, there's no right or wrong way, but it is funny to think that like the old model, just because Henry Ford created the 8-hour day, by the way, doesn't mean that has to be there forever. And I feel like we're moving away. And I think there was one company I've recently they went to the 4-day work week, which I think is going to happen eventually.
Oh, see, I think it's going to slide right back.
Really?
Yeah, we're in a different world right now. So with the high-tech bubble burst, we're looking at, it's not an employee-driven world anymore. I think...
Boy, that didn't last long.
What
was that, 2 years?
Well, no, I think it actually had been going on a lot longer. Okay. Yeah, we hear so much about culture and you want the work-life balance and the benefits and all of that. It's faded. We're not hearing that anymore. Now we're hearing, I'm spacing on the CEO's name from Wayfair. He came out and he's like, no, I've raised a company of people who don't want to be aggressively working. They're more into their work-life balance, which it creates this imbalance.
Yeah.
I needed to hear that because I work hard. And it does take this narrative of work-life balance. It's not about cutting your day off at 5 o'clock and saying, I'm not going to pick up my phone or my computer. I'm not going to respond to that. No, what we're saying with work-life balance is you're being supremely present in that thing that you're working on. So if you're with your family, be with your family. But when you're at work, be at work. And I think what was happening was, as an Xer myself, right, we just kind of folded and weaved everything into everything. So our children were watching this and saying, well, you're not paying attention to me.
Yeah.
But if we can divide down and say, okay, well, you may work 50 hours a week, but if you're in a hybrid role and you're not having to go into the office, well, guess what? Most commutes are about 2 hours a day.
Yeah.
An hour each. Yeah. So I think that's the interesting thing. Everything is really evolving very, very quickly. So it's going to be interesting to see how this continues forward. But I don't think we're going to hear as much of the pampering as we have heard.
Yeah, it was very funny. You mentioned the fact how these tech companies were, 2020, when it first happened, the pandemic, all these major tech like Apple and Google, like, we're going to be a full remote workforce. Everybody work from anywhere you guys want to live. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, wait a minute. We just spent like $1 billion on this headquarters and it's empty. We should have people come back here. And they're like, everyone had to come back. But there's also, it's the where these offices are located and the price to live. So living at affordable, the affordable wage to have these, like if you live in Northern California, most people can't buy a house unless you're making X amount of dollars. So how do companies fight that? So I see what you're saying, that there's a stream of like bringing people back to the office, but now that means you're going to have to pay these people more to work in these cities. I was a banker, I can't remember his name, but one of the guys, one of the major, like it was a JP Morgan Chase or one of those, that said, hey, listen, we pay you to be New York employees, so you get a New York wage. So you're not going to work from home. You come to the office. So talk about those wages when it comes to these cities where it can be really expensive to live. So these companies can't have their cake and eat it too. They can't be like, everybody back in the office, but you're only going to make $50,000 a year. So how do we work that?
Yeah. And I mean, we kind of always dealt with it because working with earlier stage companies, it's like, okay, you have to be able to pay them as much as you can, but you also have to be conserving your working capital.
Yeah. So how do you thread that needle?
Yeah. Well, it comes down to expectations. So I was actually written into a business plan while they were trying to raise funding, and the CEO, he asked me, he's like, where should we be putting our people? So being in Boston, I'm like, well, what's your demographic? And they're like, well, we want engineers. And I'm like, okay, well, how old are your engineers? And like, I understand that it's not legal to ask that.
Yeah.
When we start thinking about, well, they're going to have to be, senior, that's 10 years. Okay, so they have a undergrad 22, that puts them at 32. Guess what? They're not living in the city anymore. They're starting to move out to the burbs. They're starting to have kids. So think about that. If you need to have some sort of annex office for your SDRs, early stage sales people, think of something smaller, like an office that doesn't have to cost you so much, and then maybe pay for their parking, pay for their train ticket.
Yeah. And how big of a problem do you see that going forward? Because now you're saying you're going to have to, they're going to want people to work in the office. They want butts in the seats. So is it just about, like, sometimes you got to pay it's almost like the short-term loss by spending more per employee? Yeah.
It depends on how you're going to balance it. We're also seeing, because of the high-tech bubble bursting, we're seeing the salaries decrease. So they're dropping by about 10 to 15%.
Wow.
And so, it's going to be this weird thing that has to come to terms. I don't really know what the answer is.
Yeah.
I think the expectations of the employees, they're not going to have the best property. I look at my daughter, who she lives in she's in San Francisco, and what she pays for, and has 2 roommates. I mean, I know a lot of kids that would be shocked, but I raised her like an Xer, so it's like, suck it up.
Yeah, you're living with 2 other people. Who cares if they smell and the apartment's a mess? That's all you can afford. Yeah, good for you. So let's talk about that in terms of, like, the next generation, because their expectations change. They want to have a culture. Like, growing up, I didn't even know what that was, and I'm sure you did. The word culture was not a thing.
No.
And so now they expect a good culture. They also expect to be well compensated. Are companies keeping up with the Joneses when it comes to that?
I think so. Like I said, the everything's dropped. It's just a different world, and if you want to work, you're just gonna have to suck it up. I'm looking at this new generation, and I think they're getting it, though, because they saw. I think this is a weird thing. COVID was actually maybe a weird blessing for the psyche for some of our younger people. We saw a lot of creativity that came out, and it also gave them, they had to find their own purpose, because again, I'm kind of going on a different tangent here, but we were giving people trophies for everything. And in doing that, we shared with them this notion that they don't know what they're doing, but we're going to help them be good at whatever they do. And so I've been having to deal with people with more anxiety because they never knew how to process that.
Yeah.
And so I find that kind of fascinating, looking at how we get people over that anxiety and help them learn that they have purpose. And so going into a company where they can have purpose, and so money is an extrinsic value. Intrinsic value, you can have people, and we've had plenty of really impressive startups that paid jack, but because they felt so intertwined with the mission and that they felt like they had purpose, that was what kept him going. And that's what kept him for several years.
Mm-hmm. Weird off to the side here. The Me Too movement, and I know this is kind of, I brought this up randomly, but it's going to tie in, I promise. During the Me Too movement, I was obviously heightened awareness of, just mistreatment of employees and the power of men and the patriarchy. And you saw like these top dogs get, if you want to use the word canceled, fired, what have you, for doing horrible things.
Yeah.
But then you saw people caught up in the Me Too movement because they were in a bad date. So it was really, everything got kind of lost in the wash. Like everyone was comparing like sexual assault to someone like saying like something nasty on the street. Like it was all intertwined. So, and the reason I'm bringing this up, and I know it's super random, but like there's a fine line between a shitty boss and a boss that wants to make you better. Do young people get, like, as Gen Xers, we're used to shitty bosses were trying to make us better, but then there were also shitty bosses. So do younger people get this?
Oh, yeah, that's really tough. So I think it is really, really important for anybody who's in a management role to really understand how to better be and I don't like the manager side. Like I tell even my team, I'm a better coach than a manager. And sometimes I need a little bit more management for somebody. And then I'll usually bring somebody who can be a good manager because I have that struggle with clamping down, just being a little too intense. And I don't want to be that way. I want them to grow. And so I really enforce in a group, particularly like if I think of a software engineering team, it's good to have like a manager and then maybe a team lead, somebody that you can do the good cop, bad cop. Because a lot of times managers got to their position because they were extremely good at what they did. That doesn't necessarily make them a good manager.
Right.
So if there's somebody that can kind of step back and remember what it was like to be in that person's shoes, then it creates this nice balance. But I also really encourage managers. We talk about CEOs reading so many books, but managers need to be doing this.
Yeah. Oh, it's funny you said that. A CEO told me this. The worst day for his employees is the day they got back from vacation because that CEO read like 3 or 4 leadership books and he wanted to implement everything that the first day back. And like, oh, Christ, what are they going to read today? Oh, man. Did he just read a new Malcolm Gladwell book? What's going on? So book reading is good. And speaking of books, let's wrap this up by talking about the fact that you might write a book.
I might. I'm deep in the throes of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So how's that going? And what do you hope people will get out of it?
Yeah. So we need to break down this notion of hiring from a big scale. There's far more startups, bootstrapped, just your small shops. So I want to be able to give them a tool to help them understand and think through how to hire for a cash-strapped startup.
Awesome. Her name is Kate Morgan. Kate, thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And that'll do it for another Forbes Books podcast. Don't forget to leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify and hit subscribe so you don't miss any new episodes. You can always connect with me on X, LinkedIn, or Instagram at Joe Pardavila or TikTok at J Pardavila. And please don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.